Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. What a welcome. In the hot and humid Floridian air, I taste the tang of liberty. And I want to thank all of you involved with Americans for Prosperity. I want to thank the organizers, Tim, the team, and also David Koch, who couldn't be here, who have kept alive the dream of freedom during some dark times. Occasionally, it has been your lot to descend as an Old Testament prophet from the hills and call the people to righteousness, but you have never lost faith with the dream of your founders. A nation founded in the principle of independence in its broadest sense, self-reliance, personal freedom, looking for solutions inwards rather than demanding intervention from the state. That has been your achievement, and that remains your continuing task. And may I say, as a friend of America and a friend of American democracy, there are people around the world cheering you on. So thank you, all of you, who have been involved in that process. As you just heard, my country just voted to restore its independence. Now, I'll tell you what, my friends, that is not the reaction you get in most of Europe. And I'll tell you why you wouldn't. You guys understand. Your founders knew in their bones what independence truly means. They understood the connection between living in an independent country and living independently as a free citizen. Your foundational document, your elemental value, is expressed in a paper called the Declaration of Independence. And independence in the fullest sense means being self-reliant, means being an autonomous individual. Let me put that another way. You guys voted leave in 1776, and you know what? From where I'm standing, it seems to have worked out pretty well for you. I say you guys, actually, I don't think Florida did. Florida was Tory and royalist and held back and provided a great haven to all of the loyalists freeing the new republic. It wasn't incorporated, I think, until 1810 in West Florida and even later for the rest. But you know what? You guys have been making up for lost time, the Floridians here, because any state that returns Marco Rubio as a senator has more than assimilated what independence and Republican virtue really means. For all of you who put Marco there, thank you. Thank you for your service to the cause of freedom. Do you know, there's been so much nonsense written and spoken about why Britain voted the way it did. If you really want to understand what motivated us, go back to your Declaration of Independence and see how those ringing phrases applied to our referendum. We wanted to end a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution. We were complaining about abolishing our free system of English laws. We were complaining about people who were declaring themselves invested with the power to legislate for us. It was all about self-government. Our private polls during the campaign showed the same thing as the published polls. The top issue for people was democracy. And here's another phrase. This one came from a constituent of mine, a lady who works in a call center. She said, "This referendum is the working classes against the smirking classes." Now, I think that phrase wasn't actually in your Declaration of Independence. I think Jefferson tried it in the first draft, but the other drafters told him not to push his luck. But listen, if I'm trying to explain, the British class system is notoriously convoluted and tortuous, right? We don't really understand it ourselves, let alone be able to explain it to friends from overseas. But I reckon most Americans will understand what that lady was talking about, right? I think you will recognize the force of the working classes against the smirking classes. And my goodness, how they smirked during the campaign. You know how the Remain people tried right from the start to win our hearts and minds? It was by a series of lectures, of de haut en bas letters from grand people, from university vice-chancellors and captains of industry and artists and actors, all of them telling us that we were too stupid to have understood the issues and that we needed to vote for the EU in our own interest. Do you know something? One of the things that they never mentioned was how well they personally were doing out of the status quo. I'll give you one example. Almost at the very beginning of the campaign, a letter appeared in the London Times, signed by 32 captains of industry. Well, 5 minutes on Google established that their companies had spent in the previous 6 months $20 million lobbying in Brussels and had received $120 million in grants from the European Union. Now, of course, from the point of view of those companies, you can't argue with a 600% return on investment, right? But from the point of view of the general population, how is it in anyone's interest to be sustaining this cartel, this cronyist, corporatist model in Brussels? And that's what it was that we were voting to leave. Believe me, this was not a vote for nativism or protectionism or for turning our backs on our friends and allies in Europe. They will remain our friends and allies in any dispensation. But it was a vote for liberty, for democracy, and for prosperity. How did we manage it? You know, for once, the phrase "against all the odds" is exactly apposite. On the day of the poll, the bookies' odds, translated into probabilities, gave us an implied 18% chance of winning. And actually, you can't really blame the punters. They could see the extraordinary asymmetry of forces. We were being outspent 4 or 5 to 1. We had all the broadcasters against us. We had the leaders of every political party against us. We had every foreign head of government from whom David Cameron could call in a favor, including Barack Obama. Barack Obama came over and he said, you know, if you vote to leave, you'll be at the back of the line if there are any trade deals to be done. Actually, he didn't even say that. He translated it into idiomatic British for us. He said back of the queue, just to make sure that we all understood what it was he was trying to say. And yet, people politely disregarded all the hectoring, all the bullying, all the threats, and voted to take back control of their laws. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you know, I wish I had the vocabulary to explain the magnitude of what happened. You know, some journalists said it was David against Goliath. You know, that doesn't even get close, right? Let's assume that the old Philistine had decided that the odds weren't quite in his favor enough, that he'd sent back to Gath for reinforcements, that he'd got a troop of 100 more Philistine spearmen together, that they'd rushed at the little shepherd boy en masse, and boom, 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 they'd all gone down with slingshots one after another. That would have been a little bit closer to what happened, given the massive imbalance of forces against us. How did we do it? I'll tell you, we had the better song to sing. It didn't matter that the other side had all the money, all the broadcasters, all the experts, all the megabanks, all the multinational corporations, all the international bureaucracies, because we had truth and freedom on our side. In fact, do you want a really good description of what happened? Go back to some words written by the godfather of modern conservatism in 1791, Edmund Burke. Great Irishman, great British parliamentarian, of course, great friend to the American cause. He would have had the number of these Remain campaigners, all right. He would have seen the way they dominated the airwaves, dominated the newspapers, dominated the public discourse, but didn't ultimately carry the country. This is how he described it. He said, because half a dozen grasshoppers, concealed beneath the fern, make the field ring with their importunate chink, whilst thousands of great cattle take their repose beneath the shade of the mighty British oak and chew the cud in silence. Pray do not imagine that those who make all the noise are the only inhabitants of the field. Well, what we saw on the 23rd of June is that the oxen were much more numerous than the grasshoppers. But I'll tell you what, those grasshoppers are still chirruping furiously. Here we are sitting in sunny Florida drinking orange juice or whatever it is one does in Florida, and the Remain guys are on a march protesting about the fact that they lost. And the march is being led by all the lovies and the actors and the human rights activists and a few left-wing agitators. And in their world, they're saying, but everyone can see that this is a disaster. Everyone can see that we'd be better off in the European Union. And you gently have to say, yeah, everyone except the general population. We have to keep reminding you guys that more people voted to leave the EU than have ever voted for anything else in British history. And here's the thing. The oxen were right. It wasn't just that they were more numerous. If you look at the predictions that were made by the two sides during the campaign, you look at what all the academics and economists and experts were saying, and then you look at what the leavers were saying. We have so far been vindicated. We were told that if Britain voted to leave the European Union, there would be a spike in unemployment. There was a survey of all the economists. What's going to happen to unemployment in the immediate aftermath of the vote? They said it'll rise by 9,500. We got the figures last week. It's fallen by 8,600. We were told consumer spending is going to dry up. You know what? It's at a record level. We were told the British Stock Exchange will collapse. In fact, British stocks are the best performing in Europe. We were told that investment was going to dry up. Investment is pouring in, and there have been more startups launched since the vote than in the equivalent period just before the vote. We were told that house prices would collapse. In fact, house prices are rising. We were told that Scotland would leave the United Kingdom. In fact, support for the UK is stronger in Scotland now than it was before the vote. And let me come back one more time to President Obama and the back of the queue. Not only do we find that we are now talking about a free trade agreement with the US. Not only do we hear encouraging voices, not least that of the Speaker of Congress, saying that we can do this quickly and easily, but the idea of a US-EU trade deal is evaporating. It turns out there wasn't a queue at all, right? And let me now make a prediction, ladies and gentlemen. I think that not only will there be a free trade agreement between London and Washington long before, if ever there is one between Brussels and Washington, it will be a genuinely liberal accord based on open markets, competition, and the interests of the consumer. We will not have the corporatism, the cronyism, the cartel regulatory model that was creeping into the old EU-US talks, because we don't have the same defensive and protectionist mindset. You and we share a way of looking at the world, and it's a very different way of looking at the world from that of the French who are worried about their films or the Italians worried about their textile industries. We understand that free trade and free competition benefits everybody, that opening markets lifts the human species to new levels of prosperity. You want an example of a perfectly closed market that is a country that has elevated import substitution as the supreme goal of policy? You look at North Korea. South Korea, by contrast, they concentrate on making what they're best at, and they open their markets to the rest of the world. Where would you rather live? So this is going to be an opportunity for the whole world. If we get leaving the European Union right, we can revitalize world free trade. We can make the whole human race better off, and we can allow free trade to do its magical work of poverty alleviation and conflict resolution. Now, I'll tell you a thing about Barack Obama and his intervention. I should say this, and I realize that this isn't going to be a popular thing with this audience, but Barack Obama is quite well-liked abroad, and people haven't had to live with his domestic policy. And all of the polls in Britain showed that people were fond of him. So they didn't object to Barack Obama intervening in our debate. No one said, push off home, this is nothing to do with you. The issue that they had was that he was urging on us something that we knew Americans would quite rightly reject themselves. Right? Suppose that I were to stand here as a British politician and say to you, you should now have a supranational system in the Organization of American States. You should create a Pan-American parliament in, let's say, Havana, that would have the ability to override Congress. You should have a Pan-American Supreme Court in, I don't know, Managua, that would have the ability to strike down American laws. And why don't we throw in a central bank, a Pan-American central bank in Buenos Aires or somewhere, that would administer your new currency, the Pan-American peso, right? Well, I was going to say you would tell me to buzz off. I suspect you might use a stronger word than buzz, and you'd be quite right. So the objection to Barack Obama's intervention was not that he was making it, it's that he was just talking arrant nonsense. And you know what? In the immediate aftermath of his speech, of his back-of-the-queue comment, 4 opinion polls showed a significant swing to the Leave side. Now, our victory in the event was a fairly narrow one. I don't know whether your president was really a secret agent on our side all the way through, but whether he intended it or not, from the bottom of my heart, and it's not often I get the chance to say this, thank you, Barack Obama, because you may have been the guy who made the difference. Now, I hope you won't mind if I presume on our kinship to make a little intervention of my own, right? I mean, obviously we're well aware, Brits, that yours is a separate country, but we don't really think of it as a completely foreign country. You don't occupy the same mental place for us as Finns or Germans or Poles. You're kind of family. So I hope you'll excuse me if I just say one thing about the way in which you might draw on some of the lessons of our campaign. And the first point I would make is this: trust the people. Almost always, voters are wiser than the people who call themselves experts. Again and again, you've seen a consensus form which everyone agrees with except the general population. And almost always, all the experts get it wrong. They get into a self-serving groupthink, and in the event, the facts don't bear them out. Think back to the bailouts, right? It seemed a bizarre thing to any normal person that you should take money from low and medium income families and use it to rescue some very wealthy bankers and bondholders from the consequences of their own errors. Everyone agreed that this was a good thing. Everyone except the general population. And looking back on what happened, more than $1 trillion gone up in smoke, who can doubt that the experts were wrong and the people were right? Don't patronize the majority of people. As George W. might say, don't misunderestimate the people. You know, one of the things that we've been told ever since this Brexit vote is you won because you were supported by elderly, bigoted, racist, uneducated voters. Do you know, it's exactly the opposite of the truth. The reason Britain voted to leave the European Union is because we could see that it was a failed, top-down 1950s hangover, a dirigist project that has been overtaken by technology and made redundant by changes in the world. People can understand, people can see the difference between their dealings with the state, with all of the creaking inefficiencies that we take for granted when we have to interface with government, and their dealings with everything else when they go online. They could see that the European Union was not fit for purpose, and they want a more prosperous, more global, more free trading future outside it. And they're right. And in much the same way, you guys, you should disregard the self-serving, remote political elites who presume to tell you what's in your interest. I would always trust the majority of the people over those who presume to know best. And so, here's my specific pitch about US politics. You know, I've been in Florida 2 or 3 days, and every 5 minutes on TV I see an advert from Hillary Clinton complaining about the fact that Donald Trump is buying shirts from abroad or something, right? Now, let's leave aside how depressing it is that you don't have any presidential candidate loudly making the case for international trade being a good thing. How on earth has this election come down to where Donald Trump buys his shirts, or even what Hillary was doing with her emails? Can I just remind you, because it seems to have been lost, that the federal government has a debt of $19 trillion. That should be the only question that anyone is talking about. And when you have a debt of $19 trillion, that is not just your problem. That becomes everybody's problem, right? The whole world economy depends on the United States restoring order and sanity to public spending. And here's the point about these elections, something that is missed by almost all foreign media, and I think is also now missed by some of your domestic media. There are many more elections in November than just the one at the top of the ballot paper. And if we are looking to get on top of the debt, we need to elect a Congress that is going to understand that a country, like a family, has to live within its means. Do you know, I think your founders knew what they were doing when they put Congress in Article 1 of the Constitution and the presidency in Article 2. It's Congress that sets the federal budget. It's the misalignment of the majorities in Congress that has created the present mess. And if I can give you one bit of advice, it would be this: return to Congress candidates who will take their oath of office seriously, will uphold and respect the Constitution of the United States, and will return power to the people. I'm going to pass on one more tip. We won our referendum by being cheerful, upbeat, optimistic. The other side, day after day, try to scare us with stories of all the terrible things that would happen in the event of leaving the European Union. And those stories, as I said, have already gone up in smoke. But here's the thing: negativity has a real limit. Right? I could have spent the campaign complaining about Brussels fraud and mass immigration and corruption, and people would have nodded along. And at the end, even if they'd agreed with every single point I'd made, they wouldn't have voted for me because I wasn't offering them anything better. And the reason we won is because we held out the prospect of a global, free-trading, independent Britain living under its own laws while trading and cooperating with friends and allies on every continent. And that's the way you're going to win here, by offering something better. And objectively, you have got everything to be optimistic about. This remains a great country. All of the fundamentals here are good. All you need are leaders who remember that they are representatives and not rulers, and then the genius of the American people will do the rest. Think of what our two countries have achieved together. 3 times in the last 100 years, we defeated tyranny, and we elevated a system that exalts the individual above the state. All the good things in the world that we now take for granted were inventions made in the language in which you're listening to these words. Regular elections, uncensored newspapers, habeas corpus, jury trials, equality between men and women, all of these things. We call them universal values. Do you know? There would have been nothing universal about them if it hadn't been for the military victories of the English-speaking peoples. Imagine that the Second World War had ended differently. Imagine that the Cold War had ended differently. There would have been nothing universal about them then. And this can be another century dominated by our model of individualism, of free trade, of personal autonomy. We just need to have faith and hope and to keep true to this vision of the American dream. 3 days, I said, I was in Florida, and you know, until this morning it was all under leaden skies. There was heavy rainfall, it was depressing, it was wet, it was rainy, and then this morning suddenly the clouds lifted, and the sunshine was dancing on the placid waters of the lake. And the yellowthroats and the palm warblers were in the bushes, and I felt a deep conviction that the best is yet to come. Just be true to the vision of your founders, and the best lies ahead. God bless you, my friends. God bless America. And God bless the alliance of 3 English-speaking nations.